Well, I am very excited to be here, and I want to thank Josh for having me here. And yeah, I know it's been a long day, but hopefully we can get through this presentation pretty quickly. So this is meant to be a kind of quick survey of user and character design frameworks as they relate to virtual beings and virtual worlds. Um, and the kind of format for this will be through three mini chapters that we'll get through very fast that kind of end with three factoids about how our ideas of character are changing with regards to virtual worlds and virtual beings. And we're going to start with a little bit about me, or also the relationship between user experience, narrative design, and world building. And I know I'm going through some of these slides pretty fast, and there's a little bit of a lag, so I'll try to let this catch up also. So a bit about me is that the work that I do utilizes emerging technologies, and I have a degree in computational neuroscience. And I describe the work that I do as a mixture of narrative design and world building. Sometimes I call it narrative systems design or designer of narrative product. It kind of depends. But what it comes down to often is something that looks a little bit like this. And it's a process of designing a world, and designing a world I see as designing systems that relate to each other. So designing systems of governance and infrastructure and economy, and really thinking about how all these things relate to each other. So the way that we design a government affects the infrastructure that comes to life, and both of those are impacted by the economy, for instance. But those things kind of exist beyond a theoretical realm. They need to come to life within some kind of physical or spatial way. And so there's an element of creating the world and bringing it to life in a physical space with physical objects, with an environment and objects and characters that are a part of that world. And then the kind of third part of it is designing a perspective or role for the user to navigate the world. So as the user navigates the world, they come across different objects and different points of interaction within the world. And each thing within the world has its own affordances. So it can be, if we're thinking about affordances, it can be anything from a mechanic that we can interact with. It can be something more abstract, like the sun in the world. We interact with it because it lights things, because it gives rise to different systems and influences different systems, but it also is something we see, and it lights the space. And so everything within the world has these affordances that kind of feed into these inputs and outputs from a user perspective. And with user agency in the world that's kind of derived from these inputs and outputs, the user has the ability to act within the world and becomes a character in the context of the world. So this kind of leads to this emergent way of thinking about narrative that's a little bit different from when you're working in more traditional mediums, where the user is the character, the world is the environment, and narrative is what I like to call an interface. It's not something that's linear and that's handed to you. It's a nonlinear construction that kind of emerges out of the affordances of interaction and the sequence in which the user chooses to interact with them. So in a virtual world, and also increasingly in the real world, as we think about users as they respond to the environment and they react to the environment, these inputs and outputs are things that can be calculated. So we can begin to draw what is a computational model of the user as a character. And that probably sounds more sophisticated than it really should sound, but the idea is that over time you can start to map these patterns of behavior and start to think about what the user is, what they're perceiving, and what that really means for the user as a character. So we get to this kind of funny looking diagram, and we're going to actually start in the bottom part of this next image when it loads. With the way that we think about the user as existing within the context of the world is that the user has a presence within the world, and the presence is influences what the inputs and the outputs are. So the inputs being like what you can sense, what you should do, the goal is given by the world, and the outputs being what can be acted on, or where the user has agency. And that's kind of the general framework that, as a designer, when I'm designing an experience or designing a world and narrative, is how I'm thinking about the space. It's how can I control what these inputs are? How can I control what these outputs are so that these actions over time can lead to a great emergent narrative? But on a more individualistic level, if we're thinking about individual users and each individual user in terms of their perspective and what they're perceiving and seeing and sensing, and the output in terms of how they can perform or act within the space, there are a lot of questions. There's this kind of black box of character personality that bridges these inputs and these outputs. So as we start to kind of create this model of what are they taking in and why, what are the decisions they're making, and kind of what's in between them, that model that we start to create about the character can have certain things in mind. It can have a history of the user, of the character in the world. It can have player types and values in mind, some of the actions that they repeat, the goals that they've chosen, stats. All of those things are things that we can start to build out. But we still kind of run into a deeper question of what is the personality and the character that's guiding the decisions that makes people choose different options of how they're going to act in the world. What makes someone who has the same stats or someone who chooses to be the same person within the context of the world respond differently? And so that's where we get to this idea of user mediation of character. The user is coming in with all of their kind of life as a character outside of the context of the experience. And that's some of what they're bringing to this experience, either in terms of that filter from input to output, that kind of is how they're perceiving the sensation as emotion, they're converting it to thought and then decision making, but also through a history of memories, values, schemas, goals, and needs that exist in the broader context of the world. And because the user is mediating this character, they're able to bring all of this to the experience, and act on this perspective and make decisions. So this leads us to factoid number 1, which is that character can be seen as a personality architecture that filters the way that inputs from the world lead to action. And this is kind of one of the ways that the way we think about character shifts as we're dealing with these emerging mediums and designing for them. So this leads us to mini chapter 2, which is what is character, or going beyond character is what character does. So before I realized that there is the possibility to have a job doing the weird stuff that I do, I thought that I was going to be a writer. And so growing up, I'd read books about fiction writing and how to write characters. And a lot of times it talked about building out a character bio. You would build out name and description, and even the reason that characters wanted things, or the reasons that they have their backstory, who they loved, who they had relationships with. But at the end of the day, that whole kind of system of what you designed didn't really matter, because for the context of the user, the idea was character is as character does. It only matters what the user or the person who was perceiving the story saw of the character's actions. And so the idea for character in these more traditional mediums is that character is what is perceived. The character exists within a world, and they go through a series of events that are a story, and the user is not the character in this context. The user is just passively viewing character. So this has to change, though, or this kind of necessitates a change when we kind of think within this new paradigm of user being the character, the world being the environment, and the narrative being the interface. And one of the ways that it changes is that character, we have to think about character as something that exists outside of and beyond the context of narrative. It's something that doesn't just exist when it's viewed, but it's alive in the world and has its own relationship to the world. It's taking all of that idea of backstory, of goals, of needs, and basically thinking of that as an essential part of defining a character, and not just the part that is perceived by the user. This becomes especially important when we're thinking about who makes up the context of a world. If we're thinking of user as character, that's the user inhabiting a character and being a character, but also projecting a character to other users within the world, and at the same time living within the context of of a world that's populated by other characters that are exhibiting similar behavior. So this leads us to factoid number 2, which is that characters are about relationships and these two-way ways of interacting, not just passive viewing. So in the context of the world, characters are entities that can be interacted with. They're not meant to be passively viewed as also existing as users within the context of the world. They can have similar personality architectures, make decisions, take inputs and outputs, and thus one of the inputs and outputs that they can interact with is a relationship, including relating to other people. So the other quick mini chapter that we're going to touch on is bringing it all together, which is the name of the talk. It's characters all the way down. So as we kind of think about characters as they relate to these emergent mediums, the idea of this is to kind of bring it to a relation to virtual beings. Now, virtual beings or artificial beings is a really broad space, and there are a lot of ways to kind of parse it and break it down. I'm kind of choosing a rather specific way to break it down that I know is imperfect, but I'm choosing to do so for a specific reason. So breaking virtual beings down in terms of character-based virtual beings versus all-knowing virtual beings. So all-knowing virtual beings is the kind of Siris, the Alexas of the world that have godlike knowledge, or at least they're connected to the cloud and have this kind of large database that they can pull from. But there's some assumption of objectivity and truth that we expect. We don't want it to be flavored with opinion per se. That's not to say that these types of beings don't have a form of personality. They can have personality, but personality in these cases is added as an overlay on top of the information processing framework. In contrast, character-based virtual beings can act like a human. They can be fallible, and their personality is a filter. Their personality is that kind of black box you were talking about earlier that influences the inputs and has an influence on the outputs of the character. So in the context of virtual beings, then, these two kind of emergent ideas of character design come together. It both influences the way we think about how to create personalities that have a filter, or that have a way that influences the way they take inputs and process it to outputs and decide to act. And it also provides a way for us to think about how we can relate to virtual beings. So in the case of character as a framework to interpret the world, it really means that we have to think, when we're designing virtual beings, what does it mean to think through how to create a fully realized character that's not just a character, or doesn't just have a personality in terms of the dialogue it says or the facial expressions it makes, but how do we really build something that's able to draw from a history of the things we discussed as it relates to characters or users as characters and what we bring to an experience, things like memories, values, schemas, goals, and needs, and then having that as a framework to draw from as a history, and then in a more immediate way, having emotions, thoughts, and decision-making frameworks that are unique to the character that shape the way they're able to process input to output. The other kind of emergent character design element is as it relates to relationships, and it kind of leads to us thinking about what is this relationship between the being and the self in kind of two vertices. So as it's arranged in this diagram, as we move towards the kind of convergence of the X and Y axis, we move towards the user. So the X-axis is user mediation of character personality, kind of that first part we were talking about, where the user has control and brings their experience as a character to shape the design of the virtual being. And the Y-axis being the user orientation of relationships. How two-sided is this relationship with a character? How much influence does the user as a character have on the way that the virtual being that they're interacting with responds to them. So in the case of an avatar, for example, it's a user-mediated character. They are choosing how to represent themselves, and they're bringing their experience as a human to influence the decisions that the character makes. In the case of digital twin as a user proxy, it's using those decisions to build up a framework for how the character behaves over time, but there's less immediate user mediation, but it's still oriented towards the user needs. As we think about OS or virtual beings as user assistants, there is a space for less user mediation because it's oriented towards, but it's oriented towards helping the user, even if it's not controlled by the user. And then as we move to the far right upper corner, as we think about things that are artificial beings, and kind of drawing a distinction here between virtual beings, which can include things like avatars that are manipulated by humans, and artificial beings as things that have some amount of independence in their development. As we move towards artificial beings, we are thinking about them as existing in the context of the world without necessarily being oriented towards the user. They can have a relationship with the user, but it's not in service of the user. And the user doesn't mediate or control their personality in any way. So that is a quick summary and run through of user and character design frameworks as they relate to virtual beings and virtual worlds. The kind of main takeaway that I think is interesting to me and has kind of emerged from my work in a number of projects over the last couple of years is that the way that we really rethink our paradigm of storytelling and narrative and worlds and characters means that we're kind of developing these tools that exist across mediums. So as we start to define these things as we start to think about these things as they exist outside of a specific medium, we're able to think about what it means to reinterpret them as we're creating experiences across mediums and interfaces. And that's kind of an exciting space to be in.
Let me unmute. Awesome. That was a wonderful talk, Rachel. Thanks for doing that talk. I'm wondering if anybody in the Zoom room has a question or wants to say something.
Yeah, really great talk. I really love that.
Thank you.
Super insightful. I have a couple of questions actually. One of them is kind of open-ended, and one of them is more like specific. So I guess I'll do the more specific one first. On the question of like user mediation of character, do you have any thoughts on how this changes, if at all, like when there's a more sophisticated AI model that's partly driving the player character, sort of like in Sims or Dwarf Fortress characters, where you can kind of like give them orders, but then they'll also do things autonomously? Because it feels like there's like a contention almost between the player and the AI as to like who's in the character's head more and who gets to decide like what the character actually does next.
I think that's really interesting because there's definitely stuff that I didn't get to. This is like super quick, but I think there are a couple like variations on user mediation, and that's one of them where AI has more autonomy, or there dictates in terms of the systems that are designed for how the user can act. And I think that's kind of comes down to like what is the designer doing or enabling within the context of that world and experience. For example, like I think that I talked a lot about virtual worlds, but if you're thinking about the real world, there's certain things we can or can't do that, that's able to be less controlled than in the context of a virtual world. So in a virtual world, when you're designing, you can design so many other parameters that you can control. And I think the character design is one element of control that you have. But I think there's kind of like a parallel between AI as a limiting factor in those character designs, and kind of on the other side is character role playing, because the user then has this internal desire to play another character that guides the decisions they make, that isn't necessarily them as a user, but it's them playing someone else. Does that kind of answer what you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I guess second question, if I can do that one also, is have you seen Tanya Short's work on procedurally generating character personalities? Because it seems closely aligned in some ways with what you're doing.
I have been meaning to check her work out, but to be completely honest, I haven't yet.
Nice. It's really good. Yeah, I think you'd find synergies for sure with the stuff that you're talking about here.
Great. I will. It's on the list.